Let's rock and roll. Morning. Subcommittee will come to order. I'd like to thank everyone for being here. Today we'll look forward to hearing from the Federal Aviation Administration, the Government Accountability Office, industry stakeholders on the current and future state of airport financing and development. Airports serve as an important foundation, well, not just important, but critical foundation of our nation's infrastructure. They enable millions of passengers to travel throughout the United States and to destinations all over the world. Airports are also a tremendous economic driver for many communities across the United States, where airports and their air operators help connect large and small communities. Airports support over 10 million jobs with annual payrolls of over $360 billion. They produce annual output of $1.2 trillion to our economy. Airports play an important role to stimulate local economies. They connect our region to the nation's transportation grid, helping to bring additional visitors and tourism dollars to the region. Federal programs, including the FAA's Airport Improvement Program, provide funding to help enhance airport capacity, security, efficiency, and safety. Just 2 weeks ago, Atlantic City International Airport, which, if you didn't know, is in my district, was able to receive nearly $1.7 million in AIP grants to help operations and dependability. This is just one of many examples in a long-established history of South Jersey airports and stakeholders working together with the FAA to continue the standard of excellence. Looking ahead, the FAA forecasts long-term aviation growth, including additional traffic, which may require the need for increasing system capacity. In fact, I don't see how it can not have the need to increase system capacity. This forecast calls for U.S. carrier passenger growth over the next 20 years to average 2.2% per year and more than 1 billion passengers being transported in the U.S. system. Just this past May, we saw evidence to support the FAA's forecast as the majority of U.S. air carriers expanded their flying capacities in order to accommodate the increased demand of air traffic. Given these projections, industry, FAA, and Congress will need to work together and look to see what innovative approaches are out there to maintain our nation's airports' ability to continue providing safe and efficient service. This type of innovation is already taking place at the FAA's Tech Center in my district. Research is being conducted in collaboration with industry and academia to ensure that the needs of our current and future air transportation systems are being met. The FAA Tech Center also operates the National Airport Test Facility on its campus. This is a state-of-the-art, full-scale pavement research facility, which, among many other things, provides the FAA with engineered solutions for pavement designs that improve safety at airports. The subcommittee is very interested in hearing from the witnesses their perspectives on the funding mechanisms that exist to finance and develop airports and how federal programs are being utilized, what could be improved, and what challenges lie ahead. We're also very interested in hearing how industry stakeholders, from airports to air carriers, have found creative ways to retain or increase their ability to provide air service. As we turn towards reauthorization in the next FAA bill, we hope to continue this dialogue on airport financing. It is important that we hear from all stakeholders and receive your input to learn what ideas work and do not work in the real world. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and thank them for joining us. Before I recognize Mr. Larson for his comments, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material for the record of this hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, now I turn to Mr. Larson for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Lobiondo, for calling today's hearing regarding airport financing and development. In 2013, the U.S. saw over 730 million passengers travel through its airports. And by 2027, the FAA forecasts the number of annual domestic and international air passengers in the U.S. will reach 1 billion passengers, a 24% increase in domestic enplanements and a 41% increase in international enplanements within that increase. Forecasts of increasing air travel may seem encouraging for the economy, but without adequate investment, passengers may experience more congestion and delays, and our country may lose economic opportunities. In a recent study, the U.S. Travel Association found that 1 in 5 of the nation's major airports currently experience Thanksgiving-type levels of congestion at least once a week. Unless airports add capacity, 24 of the nation's top 30 airports will reach these levels of congestion within the next 5 years. There are real dollar figures associated with economic losses that will occur if our airports cannot accommodate this increased future travel. One study by the Enos Center for Transportation estimates that in 2016 alone, the U.S. economy would lose out on over $6 billion in travel spending because of capacity constraints at just 2 airports. And by 2034, the center estimates this figure would reach $48 billion annually. So the bottom line is that we can't have a big league economy if we have little league infrastructure. Our nation's airports are critical economic drivers and gateways that connect travelers all over the globe to the U.S. They also connect our local communities to each other across the nation. So we need to continue to invest in our infrastructure to remain economically competitive. At the same time, we need to make sure that we do not either overtax or overburden the aviation industry and passengers, as well as make sure that we don't put unbearable debt demands on the airports themselves. Congress has long recognized a federal role with respect to investing in aviation infrastructure. 2 important ways the federal government supports the development of airports include the AIP, Airport Improvement Program, as well as passenger facility charges, or PFCs. The FAA estimates there are $42.5 billion in AIP-eligible airport capital projects needing investments over the next 5 years, about $8.5 billion annually. And a leading industry airport association estimates a capital need at about $71.3 billion over the next 5 years, or about $14.3 billion annually. In other words, a lot of money. The FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012 authorized annual AIP funds for $3.35 billion annually through 2015. However, even with airports' ability to raise revenue through PFCs, there's a significant gap between the available funding and the investment needed for these critical safety and capacity projects. So as we prepare to authorize the FAA next year, this hearing is an opportunity for us to explore these issues facing our airports. This includes examining the current needs of our airports, how the industry is financing capital development with its limited resources, and the federal government's role to ensure adequate investment. This is no small task. There are more than 19,000 airports in the U.S., and nearly 3,400 of those airports are designated by the FAA as part of the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems, making them eligible for federal funds. They range from large hubs with commercial service to small GA airports. We have one of the greatest aviation systems in the world. Whether large or small, airports across the country have a documented economic impact on their communities, as well as the ability to connect people, goods, and services. In my home state of Washington, constituents rely on airports of all sizes. In my hometown of Arlington, general aviation at the Arlington Municipal Airport is hugely important, and the annual fly-in there brings in people from all across the country. Bellingham International Airport in Northwest Washington is developing as a commercial airport and has seen double-digit growth in recent years, requiring further investments in terminal and operation infrastructure. And my constituents rely on Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, one of the major hubs in our country's aviation system. And I'm pleased that Mark Reese from SeaTac is with us today. Each of these airports plays a different yet important role in serving the local community and the national aviation network. As this committee considers airport funding, we need to encourage investment in airports large and small. Mr. Chairman, as we recently discussed at our hearing regarding small community air service, maintaining a national air transportation system will require a sustained federal commitment. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the status of our airport infrastructure and ideas for continued investment now and into the future. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I want to take a moment before I finish to recognize a key staff member of this subcommittee who will soon be leaving us. This will be the last hearing that we will have the wise counsel of Giles Giovinazzi. Giles has been a great resource for myself and for my staff, and we'll be losing a great deal of institutional knowledge as well. And I want to thank Giles for his many years of admirable service to this committee and wish him and his family well as they move on to new opportunities, thankfully on the West Coast. Thanks, Giles. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We thank Mr. Larson, and we too would like to thank Giles for his years of service and his strong approach to solving problems. We wish you all the best in California and for you and your family. I'd now like to recognize Chairman of the full committee, Chairman Schuster, for opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lobiondo. And let me start off by thanking Giles for all of his hard work. And although he works on the other side of the aisle, he's been somebody that I've talked to and learned from over the years. He really is expert on the subject. California DOT is going to benefit by his wisdom and his hard work. So we wish you well. I had a discussion with him the other day. It sounds like we're going to see him back here in Washington occasionally, or more than occasionally. So and our door is always open to you, Giles, and best wishes to you as you move on. Again, want to thank Chairman Lobiondo for holding this hearing today to discuss the current and future funding and the status of airport financing and their development. I think everybody in the room knows the importance that airports play in our aviation system, our airline system. Not only are they the gateways to our skies, but they provide a critical role in emergency and disaster responses, and they also are economic drivers in the communities that they are in. And that's something we need to, again, make sure we pay close attention to. As the chairman and the ranking member have so ably talked about the future and the forecast, we're going to see more passengers. We're going to see more cargo moving through these airports. In this current budget situation, we're all finding out how to do more with less. However, we need to ensure that we're making the investments in the airports and maintaining the current system to accommodate that future growth. I think everybody is aware that the FAA authorization expires September of 2015. We've already begun to lay the groundwork with hearings like this and others that the ranking member and the chairman have held, making sure that we fully understand the situation. Chairman Lobiondo, myself, and Congressman Graves have held already a number of listening sessions with stakeholders to find out where they are, what their thoughts are, and ways we can improve. The FAA, I think we have a opportunity that doesn't come along often, that we're going to be able to do something significant to improve the FAA, to reform the FAA, to change the way they do business so that we can all benefit by efficiencies that NextGen gives us. And I look at the wall up there with all those chairmen, and I think every single one of them talked about NextGen at one point when they were chairman, and that goes back over 20 years ago, to maybe even 30 years we've been talking about it. And the time has come that we need to try to figure something out to get this done. We were very interested in hearing all the stakeholders, getting their views, and I know that I see a couple out there that have already had listening sessions with us. And we invite you to share your thoughts and concerns as we move forward to the next FAA reauthorization. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Yield back.
Okay, thank you, Chairman Schuster. We now will welcome our witnesses on the first panel. We have Mr. Ben De Leon, Deputy Associate Administrator for Airports at the Federal Aviation Administration, and a very frequent and welcome witness, Dr. Gerald Dillingham, Director of Civil Aviation Issues for the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Mr. De Leon, you are recognized for your statement.
Chairman Lobiondo, Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member Larson, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Federal Aviation Administration's role in developing our nation's airport infrastructure. The FAA is committed to a safe and efficient national system of airports. Our national airport planning efforts and the administration of the Airport Improvement Program, commonly referred to as the AIP program, are targeted toward addressing the citizens' most pressing needs. AIP investments will facilitate improvements in the core areas of safety, capacity, delay reduction, security, and environmental sustainability. The AIP program supports a national system of airports that includes all airports of all sizes located across the country. This system is the backbone of the aviation system that is important to the success of the U.S. economy. Because demand for AIP grant funds consistently exceeds availability, effective focusing these investments is critical to maintaining an adequate national system of airports. To achieve success in our airport planning investments, we collaborate with the full range of stakeholders. We carefully consider reports and recommendations from GAO and other organizations, and we consistently review system performance to measure success and identify areas for improvement. An area that we have identified to be in need of improvement is the ability to focus AIP resources on smaller commercial and general aviation airports. AIP grants are just one of several sources that airports use to fund capital investment. Other sources include passenger facility charges, or commonly referred to as PFCs, bonds, and airport revenues. The availability of funding sources varies with the type of airport and level of activity. For larger commercial service airports with a significant number of passengers, PSC revenues are a more flexible capital funding source. Airports with strong passenger volumes can generally issue bonds backed by future PFC revenues. As a result, larger airports are generally less reliant on AIP grants, while smaller airports may be much more heavily reliant on AIP funding. Yet many of those small airports are also very important to the overall system, either for access or to relieve pressure on larger commercial service airports. Without them, the larger commercial service airports will need to accommodate more aircraft, which can reduce capacity and increase delays. The users of large airports depend on some of these smaller airports for overall system capacity and efficiency. Focusing AIP resources on smaller commercial generation airports is prudent and necessary investment to help the entire system. The FAA reviews all requests for AIP funding with a careful focus on aeronautical need. The FAA's top priority is safety, and we have made runway safety a focus. AIP grants are funding runway safety area improvements, or RSAs, that provide an extra margin of safety around the runway should an aircraft overrun, undershoot, or stray from the runway. Maintaining facilities, including runways and taxiways and equipment in a state of good repair, is critical to the safety of the airport system. We are constantly working with airport operators to preserve existing infrastructure. In the last 15 years, 16 new AIP-supported runways were completed at many of the busiest commercial service airports in the United States. These projects and others decrease average delay per operation at these airports by 5 minutes. This might sound minor, but because the delays propagate throughout the system, that degree of improvement is significant. In closing, investments in our national airport infrastructure is crucial in maintaining the safest, most efficient air transportation system in the world. The AIP program is a vital capital funding source that works effectively with other funding sources to support the nation's airport infrastructure. Thank you again for providing me the opportunity to be here today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at this time.
We thank you very much. Now we'll turn to Dr. Dillingham. I'll now recognize you for your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member Larson, members of the subcommittee. Since 2007, there's been a significant change in the aviation industry. At many airports, aviation activity has declined and has become concentrated at larger airports. Given the potential effect of these changes on airport infrastructure demands and finances, my statement this morning focuses on two key questions surrounding airport development. First, what are the estimated future costs of airport plan development? Second, what are the types and amounts of fundings available to finance that development? Regarding the future cost of airport development, the latest estimates from FAA and the Airports Council International North America, or ACI, both show a decline in the cost of airport plan development. This decline is attributable to several factors, including airports choosing to defer projects due to reductions in aviation activities, which can be linked to the recent recession, airline consolidation, and higher fuel cost. FAA's most recent estimate of airport development costs for projects which are eligible for federal funding is $8.5 billion annually. This estimate was approximately $2 billion per year, or 18% less than FAA's previous estimate for the 2011 through 2015 timeframe. In addition, ACI estimated another $4.6 billion for plan development that are not eligible for federal funding. Therefore, in combining the latest available FAA and ACI estimates, the total estimated annual cost for plan development is about $13.1 billion. We plan to report on the updated estimates when they become available this fall for this committee. Turning to our second question regarding the types and amounts of funds available to support airport development. Overall, federally authorized support for airports, specifically AIP funding and PFCs, has declined in recent years, while non-aviation or landside revenue sources have grown. Specifically, annual appropriations for AIP decreased from about $3.5 billion for fiscal year 2011 to about $3.35 billion in fiscal years 2012 through 2014. In addition, while the current House and Senate Appropriations Bill keeps the amount of AIP funding at or above current levels, the President's 2015 budget calls for a reduction in AIP appropriations to $2.9 billion. With regard to PFCs, since PFCs were first approved in 1990, they have expanded to include 388 airports. However, collections are very concentrated, with almost 90% of all PFCs going to large and medium hubs. Total PFC collections also declined along with passenger traffic during the last recession, but since have rebounded to $2.8 billion in 2013. The federal cap of $4.50 per PFC has not increased since 2000. As a result, many airports' future PFC collections are already committed to pay off debts for past development projects, leaving little room for funding new development. The President's 2015 budget has called for increasing the PFC cap to $8 while eliminating AIP for larger airports. In response to declining federal support for airport development, airports have sought to increase their non-aviation revenues. By focusing on other business activities to generate revenues, some airports have become involved in an increasing range of unique developments on airport properties. For example, some airport operators generate revenues through temporary leases of airport property for uses as diverse as solar farms, oil extraction, cattle grazing, and golf courses. In addition, public-private partnerships involving airports and developers are being used to finance airport development projects, such as the planned terminal construction at LaGuardia Airport in New York. However, these options are not available to all airports. Many airports, especially those located in smaller communities, could not survive without federal support. These airports provide a vital link to the nation's aviation system for those communities. Mr. Chairman, as the committee begins its deliberations for the 2015 FAA reauthorization and the appropriate federal support for airport developments, it will have some critical questions and information needs. These include whether declining federal support could negatively affect the national system of airports and the communities they serve, whether greater private investment could be encouraged at airports, and if an increase in the PFC cap is warranted. We are currently assessing these issues for this committee and expect to report our findings out later this year. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hey, Doctor, we thank you very much. We'll now go to some questions. For you, Mr. De Leon, with the talk about the AIP grants, and last year the FAA issued about $3.2 billion. Can you walk us through the collaborative process to approve or deny an AIP grant application to get the money to the airports? How does that work?
Yes, sir. We like to pride ourselves that we're pretty collaborative with our airport sponsors. We work really close with them. We actually start probably in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 years in advance of issuing a grant and planning stage, and we work with them to identify their critical needs today and in the future, and hopefully later on work for future grants. And so we start that early with them, working with them in a transparent process, and then we follow them through the environmental process for that particular project. When we get to the actual construction, designing, and building the project, we actually work real close with them to identify a funding plan that works for both parties and also meets their timeline. So generally speaking, a lot of our projects, we're collaborating with them early on, that we don't end up denying projects. We just work close with them. It's more of a timing and when we issue the grants with them. We try to keep that open.
And you respond to AIP grant applications, correct?
That's correct.
So you don't initiate the project. You review the projects that are presented for the grants by the airports.
Well, we don't initiate the actual grant application process, but before that it happens, we've been working with them behind the scene already on projects that they need to meet their critical needs. And so we've already had a number of discussions before the application comes in.
But that's when the airport comes to you and starts talking about what the needs may be, and you start working through with the discussions, preliminary discussions.
Yes, sir.
Correct. Last year, also for you, Mr. De Leon, airports spent roughly $2.8 billion on PFC projects, and the FAA issued, again, $3.2 billion in AIP grants. Can you please help us understand the fundamental difference between AIP and passenger facility charge dollars and what they can be used for?
Well, generally, PFC dollars are follow the same eligibility under EIP project-wise, except I think PFC has.
Can you pull your mic closer to you?
Sorry. PFC has the same eligibility requirements of AIP for projects, except they can be used for gates and boarding gates and that kind of stuff, you know. So there's a lot of similarities there. But what we've seen is that a lot of the large airports that implement PFCs, they usually use that PFCs on landside type projects. And then we use the AIP funding on the airside projects. So it's sort of a balance between the two.
Dr. Dillingham, could you tell us, in your view, what would be the impact on AIP entitlement and discretionary funding if the President's budget request of $2.9 billion for AIP were enacted?
Yes, sir. According to the existing statutes, if the AIP appropriations is less than $3.2 billion, it significantly reduces the entitlement funds that are available, and therefore it would have a more devastating effect on small airports, since they are rely more heavily on AIP than do the larger airports. It's about formula, sir.
Okay. And we understand that the GAO is currently conducting a study that will include an analysis of potential impact of raising the passenger facility charge. Can you tell us what issues are included in that study, when the study will be completed, and how do you think the findings of that study will be helpful to the committee?
Yes, sir. We do have a study of PFC underway for this committee. We are intending to look at various scenarios of the impact of raising the PFC and how airports, in fact, decide to impose that PFC. All airports may not decide to impose the full PFC that the Congress will grant. I think probably one of the most important concerns is the impact on traffic. If what we have in our past experiences, we looked at what was the impact of imposing the $3 security fee a couple of years ago, and what we found was that there was a loss of passenger traffic, about 1% loss of passenger traffic over a 3-year period. That was about 26 million passengers. I mean, as you know, Mr. Chairman, there's a certain amount of price elasticity for anything that we buy. I mean, if it gets to a certain price, then we will choose not to purchase it. Now, clearly, this may not impact certain kinds of passengers like business travelers who need to go, but it may impact the recreational traveler where you get just to that edge and they can't pay another $35 or $36 or $100. So we're trying to develop those scenarios so that we can provide them to this committee as they make their deliberations for the 2015 reauthorization.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. DeLeon, so the President's request proposes to decrease AIP grants by about $450 million. It also proposes to increase the PFC cap. Do you have an estimate of how much additional funding for infrastructure projects would that generate, the net that would generate?
Yeah, with the increase of $8 to ticket tax, we estimate that will add roughly about $2.5 billion extra above that the primary airports could use for airport development.
Yeah, okay. If the cap was increased to $8 and airports took advantage of that, and large airports as well gave up AIP grants as proposed, would the FAA have any role in ensuring that airports would first invest in safety, capacity, enhancing competition as opposed to investing in revenue-producing projects?
Our thinking is that even if the large airports move out of the program and return some of their entitlement dollars, that they will still have access to some discretionary dollars, particularly if we have some safety initiatives, national safety initiatives that we want to impress on the system itself. For instance, the Runway Safety Air initiative that we have underway right now, it's important that we implement that across the country. So in cases where we have a special initiative, safety initiative particularly, that we would probably allow them access to some discretionary.
Yeah. Well, hope the airports can address that a little bit as well when they're up here. Since 2005, there have been 3 mergers involving 6 major legacy carriers in the U.S. Has the FAA itself done any or have any view of how industry consolidation has affected capital needs of airports throughout the system?
We have not done a formal analysis. We've seen it come about. There's a lot of dynamics in the aviation system right now, the consolidation, upgauging, downgauging. We're not sure how the actual dust is going to settle on some of the hubs and stuff, if they continue to operate or not. So it's more or less kind of wait and see. We're doing an internal kind of review, but not until something gets finalized on the airline side.
Yeah, great. Dr. Dillingham, can you answer that question? Have you looked at that question?
Yes, sir. We haven't focused specifically on that, but as part of our general monitoring of what goes on in the aviation industry, there are a couple of things that seem obvious to us. One is that some of the well, I agree with Mr. DeLeon that you can't totally separate out the effect of consolidation, but you can look at certain elements of consolidation, like the decision to de-hub an airport or to de-hub as part of consolidation. You would see less activity at that airport. Activity is what takes a toll on infrastructure. You will also see when there are things like de-hubbing or consolidation where certain airports are no longer as active as they used to be, you will see a case where, again, airports will either decide not to do infrastructure or delay that infrastructure, again, related to aviation activity.
Yeah, okay. Also, Dr. Dillingham, has GAO concluded if at current AIP funding levels, if they continue as they are, would they be sufficient to meet planned capital development costs for the next 5 years?
Mr. Larson, I think it was said earlier that there is a continuous gap between planned development and available funds, and we don't expect that will change. We will know better when both FAA and ACI-NA come out with their new estimates, and we were able to complete that work that we were also doing for this committee for the 2015 reauthorization. But, bottom line is there's likely to be a gap, and we are careful to say planned development as opposed to needed development, because there is a difference there.
I like to say demand is infinite. Need you can define. So finally, Dr. Dillingham, this question of PFC and the cap versus AIP versus the general capacity of airports to finance development. Has GAO at all looked at the ability of airports to finance capital improvements through debt? And if you have you looked at the difference between, say, a public airport like a SeaTac, which is a Port Authority airport, versus a privately run airport? Have you looked at that kind of issue at all?
Generally, what we found is that airports, especially large airports, are very stable and rather, it's not the right term, I was going to say easily obtain capital funding from the private sector in terms of bonding. But that is where about, I think, 50% of airport funding derives from. a much smaller proportion of public funding through bonds is available to small airports. We see it as about 15% for small airports. And part of the work that we're doing now in terms of looking at the status and financial status of airports, we are hearing from the bond rating agencies on Wall Street that airports have excellent bond ratings. So that should continue into the future, especially as passenger traffic increases, as was mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Good. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Schuster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. De Leon, of the, I think you said it was $3.35 billion in AIP funds. Is that the number total?
Yes.
What's the breakdown between the entitlement, what's spent on entitlements, what's in discretionary, what goes out in formula, and what goes out in grants?
Generally, the breakdown is that if you take the $3.3 billion, about 2/3 of it is entitlement dollars, at least classified entitlement dollars. About a third is discretionary.
And you know, looking at the challenges the FAA faces in administering those AIP funds, I've traveled around the country and I talk to the airlines, I talk to the airport, and sometimes they're not always on the same page as to what investment should be made in the airport. When you're giving these grants out, do the airlines weigh in on what you give to an airport? Do they, being that they're the customer, or even the GA community that uses some of these airports significantly, they may have differences of opinion. Do they have a voice in the
we like to say yes, but it's not always the case. We like to have the airports really coordinate and actually coordinate the projects with the tenants and the community, because we find out that if they do that and they collaborate, the projects are easier to administer.
Right.
But truly doesn't happen across the country.
Right. And what are the biggest challenges you face on AIP grants?
I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that we have some safety initiatives that we really want to undertake, and they're good-sized safety initiatives and stuff. And so we want to be able to use discretion toward safety, because safety is number one for the FAA. So we have a lot of things going on in the safety umbrella. We've taken care of the capacity, so the capacity is pretty good for right now, but it's not going to stay that way forever.
Okay. Mr. Dillingham, it's good to see you back here again. You are a regular visitor. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You talked about the security fee increase and the price elasticity of it, and 26 million less customers. And we see that the airline industry now, the demand appears to be up on seats. Their prices are inching up, which we understand that's the way it works, supply and demand. As we see that increase, and I know there's talk, the president proposed, I think, $8. The airports have proposed $8.50, $4, $3.50, $4 increase. Have you done an analysis on, with an improving climate in the airline industry and prices going up there, as well as putting higher fees on? Do you have any analysis on what kind of downturn that's going to have on passengers? Or
Mr. Chairman, those questions that you ask are part of our current work that we're doing for you and the subcommittee. We expect that we'll be able to report that out to you by the end of the year.
All right. Well, I thank you for that and look forward to seeing that. And I know we've got to figure out how airports need money. Everybody in the country is clamoring for more money when it comes to especially infrastructure and transportation. If you increase an increase on the PFCs, what kind of benefit do you see for the airports? And again, the proposal is they raise the PFCs and they eliminate AIP funds. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
And what kind of benefit do you project?
Well,
That's something you're looking at also?
Yes, but it's sort of, it's already established that if the airports get a raise in PFCs, it would allow them to undertake more infrastructure projects. And also, the other side of it is that if they impose that full PFC, then monies are turned back to the FAA, and that money becomes part of discretionary and also available to smaller airports. So it's a sort of a two-way street that goes there, keeping in mind that, again, on those margins, the passenger traffic could be affected, and if the passenger traffic is affected, less tickets are sold, less money goes into the trust fund. So it's sort of a complex sort of merry-go-round that happens there.
Right. And, of course, one of my big concerns coming from a rural area is small airports and even medium-sized airports. The Pittsburgh Airport, for example, has had a significant reduction in flights to it. They, fortunately, though, are one of those airports that they've found natural gas on the airport. So they've finally, instead of trying to fight the FAA, want to spend the money in downtown Pittsburgh, they finally realized that the money has to stay on site, which is I'm very happy that that's happened in Pittsburgh. And you mentioned other airports, golf courses and various other developmental projects to help them gain revenue. Do you consider that into the formula when you in the discretionary and the grants you give on the AIP funds? Is that factored in anywhere, or is that not considered in?
Like I say, it's probably considered at some point in time, but when we issued the grants, we're talking about their matching funds, our matching funds, the ability for them to put the money up front. A lot of times, it's not a question if they can't make the matching funds. More is the project eligible and ready to go and move forward. So we don't really get too deep in the non-aerial.
So I guess my real question is, they're not penalized.
No.
Pittsburgh Airport's not going to be penalized for the great fortune they have of finding natural gas on.
No, sir.
Okay. I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Dillingham, since I know your current report is specifically on airport funding, but I want to delve back a little bit into some past work you've done. As the Democratic author many years ago of PFCs, because I saw inequities where, for instance, people from Vancouver are using the Portland airport and don't even pay taxes in the state of Oregon, I thought it was an equitable way to deal with these issues. The initial concern was abuses, off-airport uses and other abuses of the PFCs. And I think in the past you've actually looked at those issues, what the authorized uses are and whether there has been any deviation from those. Can you update us on that? Are PFCs being used well within the existing authority and the law and usefully?
Mr. DeFazio, to our knowledge, PFCs are in fact being used for their intended purpose and in fact are achieving what the objectives of the legislation were. FAA is pretty they're pretty tough on revenue diversion, and it is one of their priorities to ensure that those kinds of things don't happen or are minimized. Okay,
so and we've documented the need for, I mean, the current state of our aviation infrastructure. I mean, it's not as bad as surface, but I mean, we certainly have unmet needs, and you've gone through those numbers. I mean, what are the? I mean, I just can't think. We've got AIP, which we're spending less than the annual income to AIP, are we not? I mean, we see a growing balance in the trust fund.
Yes, we do see a growing balance in the trust fund. In fact, the balance in the trust fund now, I think FAA is projecting 2013 or 14 that it'll be $4.4 billion plus.
Okay, and is that because they need like an operating cash flow reserve for commitments they're made, or is that far exceed those needs?
I'm probably not in the best position to answer that. Maybe Mr. DeLeon.
Okay, Mr. DeLeon, can you answer that question?
Checking with the budget office this morning, we asked the same question about the trust fund balance, and what we were told is that there is a current balance of roughly $13 billion in the trust fund, and there's roughly between $4 and $5 billion that's uncommitted in the trust fund right now.
And is what I mean, you know, with highways we have a number. You can't drop below that number and meet obligations on an ongoing basis because you have a cash flow issue. Do you know what that number is for the trust? It wouldn't be $4 billion. It would probably be substantially lower than that.
I do not know, sir. I'll take an IOU on that.
Okay, that would be a useful thing to know. So we got AIP, we got PFCs, we got rents, we got the entrepreneurial activities, and now we have some privatization. If I can only see one of, I guess two of those potentially, I don't know, private investors need return, so I'm not sure that that'll go there. Entrepreneurial, you know, is, I guess, the only one. But rents, PFCs, and or the financing of AIP should we raise the tax, all of those will be reflected in ticket prices, ultimately. Correct?
Yes, sir.
So I guess then for those who don't want to raise PFCs, I guess they would say the only place airports can go would be entrepreneurial activities that wouldn't bring back a burden, because the privatization, you got to have, in fact, maybe even more return there because they need a return on their investment. So that maybe even puts a higher burden on potential charges towards passengers.
Yes, sir. Non-aeronautical revenues are going to be the least burdensome to the taxpayer.
Right, but how limited are those? I mean, I assume not all airports have that option, and even the airports that do have that option, how much of the unmet need do you think that could cover?
You're correct that all airports don't have that option. The last numbers we have, I think 2012, 45% of airport revenues were attributable to non-aeronautical revenues, beyond the entrepreneurial, but including the biggies of parking and ground transport. That's still going to leave a gap because of the what is termed planned development needs.
Okay, and if you say substantially raise the car rental fees, or you substantially raise the parking fees, that also has some sort of a detrimental impact on consumers planning a flight, because they look at what the whole thing's going to cost them.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so there's no easy way out of this.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Meehan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the experts here for their testimony on this issue. One point I'm just trying to understand is when you're doing your projections, and these are important because they look at the long-term implications. So I listened to Dr. Dillingham's testimony today about the impact that the economy is having on travel, and therefore reduction in utilization. Maybe it's at smaller airports. I really am not completely clear. But then I look at the FAA's projection, and you're saying that airport is going to grow at 2.2%. Travel is growing at 2.2% a year. How do you reconcile the differences in that, and where really is airport travel going to be over the course of the next 5 years? Mr. DeLeon, do you know?
Well, from an AIP program perspective, yeah, we have the forecasts out there that we use as one factor for evaluating how we move or fund projects. But what we actually work with the sponsor. We actually look at who's actually using the airport today, what type of aircraft are using aircraft today, and what aircraft are actually coming in. And a lot of airport sponsors have commitments from other people that if you had a certain runway length or a taxiway or something like that, we would come in and do business at your airport. That's actually factored into us when we provide AIP funding, more so than long-range forecasts.
Okay, one of the issues, and I'm more interested in pursuing this further, but in the limited time, the issue that's of significant importance to me, representing an area in the Northeast in which there's a fair amount of congestion. What role does congestion play in the impact on costs associated with airports? And I'm trying to find the right balance in which we're looking at improvements in things like NextGen. And there's concerns about where we are in the form of the implementation of NextGen. But, do we have technologies that are going to impact the need for airport expansion, or how do we measure appropriately what the right amount of airport expansion is to deal with congestion?
From the FAA standpoint, when we look at capacity or delays at airports or metropolitan area, we look at airport development on the ground, but we know that in order to maximize the development on the ground, example, a new runway, a major runway extension, coupling that with next-gen technology makes the return on that investment even much better. So what we're working as we go ahead, we're trying to incorporate all the next-gen technology that's available and incorporate it into our development.
So even though you may be expanding or improving the efficiency and therefore the on-time arrival and therefore reduction in costs, there's still a critical role to be played by expanding the amount of asphalt, so to speak, to create more landing base?
I would say that right now, as we look at the capacity across the nation, we're probably fine for the first decade here. But there are some places that we understand they're chronically delayed, and we have issues at. I'm not sure what the answer is in those locations, and it's you probably can guess where they are. The New York area, very difficult place to figure out what to do on that, because I don't think paving the ground.
How do we figure that out? Because it's critical. I mean, these are things that I'm struggling with
Sure.
because I'm trying to find out the right balance to be able to ascribe who's responsible for what. We want to promote on-time delivery because there's a point in which the testimony here today is lost opportunity. I mean, we have people who do not get a chance to take trips because of congestion and other kinds of things. This is the testimony I'm reading. How do you find out where the right balance is between, investment, the right balance that will help us deal with the congestion?
Well, I like to say that it starts, at least from the FAA standpoint, it starts in the planning process, working really closely with the airport sponsor and getting the information in front and working with all the stakeholders and finding out what the issues are and trying to address the issues. That's the best place to start, is in the planning process. As you go in the environmental process, it gets a little tighter because you got to address purpose and need and balance the environmental impacts. But if you do your proper planning up front and get all the information up front, that really helps the process in the long run, and that's where it starts.
Mr. Meehan,
Yes, Dr.
if I
Dillingham.
could.
Yeah.
There are several initiatives underway. I just want to relate back to your point about NextGen. Although NextGen has been going on for 10 years, we are now beginning to see NextGen being put in place, a suite of NextGen technologies like in the Houston Metroplex. And so that's going to make going and coming out of that metropolitan area much smoother, much more environmentally friendly. At the same time, the question you raised earlier with regard to sort of what else is NextGen going to do, well, we've said a number of times before this committee that NextGen is not going to be enough, that it's going to address some of our problems, but as our passenger traffic increases, we're going to need to lay some more concrete. And FAA currently has a study underway that identifies, I think it's the third iteration of a study that identifies where those congestions are going to be and where their concrete needs to be laid. So there are a number of avenues coming together to address the issues that you presented.
When, Mr. Chairman, just when do you expect that report to be concluded? I'm Master Dr. Dillingham.
Well,
yeah.
he can tell you when the fact report is going to be concluded. I just know they're doing it.
Okay. When?
Yes, sir. The report's scheduled to be completed in the summer, beginning of fall.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, you go back.
Mr. Capuano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, gentlemen. We're faced with another situation. People want more money than we have. Gee, how unusual. Never heard that before. And I'm told that airports have plenty of money. But am I wrong to think, Mr. Leon, there are all the major airports, all the medium-sized airports, basically publicly owned and financed? Is that a correct assumption?
All the large major airports are public owned, yes.
Which means the taxpayer is on the hook if an airport has a financial problem. It may not be a federal taxpayer, but they're my taxpayers too. It may be state or local or regional, but it's a taxpayer.
Well, the large hub airports have other funding mechanisms that can tap into bonding.
I understand that, but those bonds and everything, if everything goes bad, who's on the hook if Logan Airport goes bankrupt? Massachusetts taxpayers.
That's correct.
That's right. If their bond rating goes up because they overextend themselves and something goes bad, who's on the hook?
The owner.
Taxpayers. My constituents. My taxpayers. Now, I'm not against that. I'm a liberal. I don't mind taxing people for things they want, but I want to be clear that airports are not some private entity. They are taxpayers who gathered together to do something. Private financing. I've heard some comment on that. We just went to LaGuardia on a P3 field hearing, at which they told us, yes, they're going to use private financing for one reason and one reason only, because they have to do the work in their estimation. They can't get the money anyplace else. So private financing is not some panacea. private financing is the result of not having enough money. And yet today I hear there's a $4 billion surplus. Now, based on my math on the surface transportation, which has to be somewhat relevant, approximately each $1 billion makes 30,000 jobs. We're talking 120,000 jobs are going unhad in this country today because we have uncommitted money that has been paid by taxpayers? I come from a different universe. That strikes me as insane. Get that money to work. Put people to work. Address some of these issues so we can have an honest and legitimate discussion about where the money should come in the future. Mr. Dillingham, has GAO ever done a study on bang for the buck relative to PFCs and AIPs?
What we have done is we've looked at what PFCs have been used for, how those uses coincide with the statute. I'm not sure.
Well, the reason I ask is because there are a fair number of airports around the country that, especially in the last couple of years with contractions, we now have pretty large investments in airports that are now underutilized. And if the argument is that airports are important, that the expansion of airports are important to our economy, shouldn't we be spending money where the economy is best enhanced, either through passengers or delay reductions or other such items that do have a direct impact on the economy, as opposed to letting taxpayer dollars be used to, oh, I don't know, maybe put another clothing store at a mall. By the way, have either of you gentlemen ever bought a suit at an airport?
I can't afford them, Congressman.
Very good answer. Yet taxpayer dollars, some of these dollars on occasion are used to support the expansion of airport malls. That strikes me as very bad prioritization. Now, if an airport wants to create a mall, let them do it with their own money. Never, 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 for those of you who don't speak English, never allow taxpayer dollars that are meant to address safety and efficiency be used to sell a suit. Now, I have to buy suits too. I've never bought one at an airport. It just strikes me that our priorities are wrong. We're having this discussion prematurely. We have money in the bank not being used to do the things we need to do. We're not sure what the priority should be, yet there's extra demand. Well, demand for what? To have another glorious terminal? I have never once in my entire political life had somebody call and say, I didn't like the terminal. I get lots of calls saying delays, cancellation. I get lots of calls, costs, extra fees. I've never had anybody say, oh, the terminal wasn't pretty. Prioritization, gentlemen. Use the money more wisely than we have, then come back to us and talk to us about increasing costs and fees to taxpayers and the public. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Fehrenfeld.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I will say to the gentleman from Massachusetts, you probably haven't flown out of Terminal A here at Reagan National Airport lately, because that one is ugly. But I do want to address a couple of questions to our witnesses. There's been a lot of talk about the PFC. What are some alternatives that are available to airports for funding? We've heard public-private partnerships. We've heard direct tax subsidies, both from the state, federal, and local government. Are we missing anything in there? I'll ask both gentlemen. We'll start with Mr. De Leon.
No, I think you probably covered it. I think privatization is one of the things we're looking at right now. It hasn't taken off in the States, as you know, but we have an improved application in San Juan, Puerto Rico. It's pretty interesting. It looks like it's pretty promising. So monitoring that, watching that as we go through. Other than that, I think you've covered all the other avenues I can think of.
Mr. Dillingham, are we missing anything there?
No, I think you did. I think you covered it. If you included non-aeronautical revenues, landside revenues that have been increasing at about 4% a year over the last few years, to the point that they are now representing about 45% of aviation revenues.
But now, do these shopping malls actually make money and pay for themselves?
I don't really know. I would assume that there's a little bit of both in terms of some make money, some don't. There's also the notion of street level pricing, where in some cases airports,
Right.
you pay in the airport is supposed to be,
And I understand that's a contractual provision in some
Right.
airports that you have to be competitive in the pricing.
Right.
And I will, on behalf of my chief of staff who left his belt at TSA, was very thankful he could purchase a belt at the Houston airport when he got there and realized he'd left his belt in Washington. Let's talk a little bit about PFCs. We've heard a lot of reference to them as taxes, but they sound to me more like a user fee. If airports are directly subsidized by the cities or the federal government, the non-flying public is paying for that, which I guess is okay because they receive the benefits of the economic activity that the airports generate. But don't you think that PFCs might be more accurately described as a user fee than a tax, Mr. DeLeon?
I guess I have no comment on that. But really,
Mr. Dillingham, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the point that you raised, Congressman, is sort of is a point that's been raised time and time again. It gets to be one of these, you say tomato, I say tomato kind of thing, and it depends on who's talking, whether it's a user fee or a tax.
All right. Well, I appreciate you all being here, and yield back the remainder of my time.
And Mr. Maloney.
I have no questions at this time, sir.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dillingham, Dr. Dillingham, thank you and welcome back. Please tell us, sir, more about what your study uncovered about alternative methods for collecting the passenger facility charges without really including these charges in the ticket price. Practically, what would you recommend we consider?
Thank you, Mr. Carson. We completed that study for this committee, basically responding to the question that you posed about alternative ways to collect that PFC. We did not find any other ways at this point that was more efficient for collecting PFCs. We looked at things like smart apps, kiosks, all of those kinds of things had an impact on the convenience of the passenger. So, the current system was the most efficient one that we've seen. We are now looking at, since we finished that last study, are there ways in which that fee could be collected that is different than what we looked at before, in addition to those other questions regarding PFCs in terms of, what are the various scenarios that the Congress should have in mind as they think about this for 2015?
Secondly, and more generally speaking, in the great Hoosier state of Indiana, our airport directors recently briefed our delegation on their consensus about the need for Congress to raise the cap on passenger facility charges. Now, they're being as creative as possible to finance the critical infrastructure projects needed across the state, but it's simply not enough. First, what do you all think is possible, or even realistic for that matter, for our local airports to make infrastructure improvements without raising their PFCs? And secondly, if you agree that PFCs need to be raised, how should that be done, and what do you recommend in this context?
Well, I can just speak just a little bit about Indianapolis. Indianapolis is one of the poster card airports for non-aeronautical revenues. In terms of the unique sorts of things that they're doing, Indianapolis, along with Denver, is one of those airports that are starting to develop solar farms to provide energy as well as sell that energy along the way. So to that extent, I mean, that is one other avenue that, you know, Indianapolis is a leading actor in.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Dillingham. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. DeLeon, are airports eligible for TIFIA loans?
No, that's a separate funding program administered by the department.
So is that by policy or by statute that they would keep them from being eligible?
I would say it's statute, but I'll check that on there and take an eye on that.
Dr. Dillingham, you had mentioned that NextGen potentially would exasperate the fact of a lack of facilities at particular airports, because I assume that more efficiently and maybe even more frequently planes could land, and yet there may not be a terminal to accommodate them. Is there any, which would call for, I assume, more infrastructure, as you put it, concrete, at that location? Is there any study that you have done on the return on investment of every dollar, let's say, is spent at an airport? Is there some sort of factor like 7 to 1, 6 to 1, or anything like that?
Congressman, we have not done any studies like that, but I am familiar with many metropolitan areas where airports are located. They have conducted those studies to talk about the economic impact of their airport and aviation to the community. And you know, we can provide, you know, references to those if you would like, but we have not done any studies like that directly.
Well, it was asked earlier, I believe, something about, you know, where do we get the bang for the buck, and where are the priorities? I think it would behoove us to know if this would be the very best investment of our infrastructure dollars may be here. I don't know that it is, and maybe no one does, but it certainly would be nice to know.
Yes, sir.
Yield back.
Mr. Davis. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm from Texas. We've got a lot of airports there, and we appreciate you all being here today. My first question would be to you, Dr. Dillingham. You said that airports are seeking more private sector partnerships. I'm a big private sector guy. I believe in the private sector. Everything from construction to ownership of terminals. We talked about that. What are the implications in federal funding for an airport with various levels of privatization, such as long-term leases and public-private partnerships? I guess my question would be, will federal funding still be needed or required if we really get engaged with the private sector and let the private sector move us forward in this?
I guess the best answer is it depends. Depending on the arrangements, the privatization type arrangement, long-term lease or full sale, those airports will still be eligible for certain federal funds. The airport that was mentioned, the only airport that has been privatized to date is in San Juan, and you know, as a result of that airport has been significantly upgraded, and the federal funds that were associated with it have been decreased significantly.
So the more private sector involvement would decrease the need for federal funding?
I think so.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. DeLeon, my question would be, I'm glad that we've got $4 billion in cash. As a small business owner, that's important. Cash flow is important. But my question to you would be, and we talked about this, but the current funding stream, is it enough now to sustain all the demands we're looking forward for? I mean, is it?
Well, if you look at our NIPIA's National Plan of Airport System report, it implies that no, we're not meeting all demand out there. There's more demand than we have funding for. But I think, as Mr. Dillingham mentioned, we're looking at what is really needed today, and that's how we approach with our airport sponsors, trying to work with them on what's really needed today and not just plan. So we manage it as best we can, but there is a little more demand than there is funding available.
We talked a lot about available funding, but as a business person, you can generate cash through more business, or I guess you can raise prices, which sometimes is not the best thing, or you can cut expenses. So I guess my question to you would be, since September of 2008, small business owners have really had to cut back. They've had to cut back on a lot of things to create their own cash flow and continue to do business. What are you all doing to cut expenses and pass that on to the consumer?
So we in the FAA, what are we doing to cut expenses? In my organization, I think the best answer I have is that to maximize the use of the AP dollars as much as we can. We work with airport sponsors to possibly phase out projects over a longer time, which is not always good, but not bad to proceed because you have a limited amount of money. Personally, our organization is not streamlining people, retiring people and stuff like that. That's what you're leading to, where we work the IP program as best we can to maximize the return on it.
But are there costs you can cut that would turn into cash flow and turn into giving people more service and better service? Every business has a surplus of whether it be people or costs. I mean, every business needs to be able to cut costs, and that was my question. I mean,
yeah, I don't think I could answer the question as we're cutting costs. I think we're trying to improve efficiencies of what we have. As a business, you try to maximize your efficiency as best you can if you're spending the money. So we're looking at ways to become more efficient, the way we administer the program, the way we run the program.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Dillingham and Administrator De Leon for being here today. I just have one question for both of you. The American Association of Airport Executives is represented on the next panel, and in their testimony, they cite a study that says in the next 5 years, 24 of the top 30 airports will experience Thanksgiving-like passenger levels at least one day a week. And as a passenger who travels during the holidays, I know that can be daunting. Can both of you address this statistic and then what is being done now and what more could be done to prepare for such passenger levels at those airports?
Ms. Davis, I can't deny or support the AAAE's numbers. However, over time, the delay factor for airports has declined. It used to be 1 in every 4 flights was delayed. FAA has made significant improvements on that. Going forward, I think we're all relying on the implementation of NextGen and the procedures that are associated with it, both on the ground and the technology associated with GPS. I think that's where our hope is at this point. And what we're talking about today in terms of having the appropriate infrastructure to handle that predicted increase in traffic is also an element going forward that hopefully will address those issues that AAAE has raised.
Okay. Administrator De Leon?
Yeah, as Dr. Dillingham mentioned, we are completing the Future Airport Capacity Task Force study, known as FACT-3. It's going to come out in later summer, early fall. And when you look at that report, it's not going to be any surprises to it. It's going to identify that it looks actually at operations at the airports at 2020 and 2030. Looking forward, and it considers all the airport improvement that's in the pipeline for these airports, and it also considers next-gen technology that will be on board at that point in time. And what we're going to see in that report, when you look at it, you'll see that in the first decade, the hub system overall is in fine condition right now. The problem runs is when you look at 2030, many unknowns at 2030 because of all the things that are happening in the aviation industry right now is that we can't predict with certainty what's going to happen in 2030. So as we move to 2030, our thought is that we're going to just have to approach that more cautiously in the planning process and just keep an eye on the system going forward.
All right. Well, thank you both for your time today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Duncan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Dillingham, Mr. Capuano mentioned that he and I and several others met yesterday with some of the top people from Wall Street, and they said that they were finding more interest and receiving many more phone calls about public-private partnerships in regard to infrastructure than ever before. In fact, they were surprised by the amount. Do you think that, and most other developed or developing countries have been going more in that direction than we have? Do you think that we will be seeing much more of that? We met after the meeting with the Wall Street people. We met with the LaGuardia officials yesterday afternoon, and they told us some of what they were doing. Do you see more of that in the future? And secondly, in a related part of that, why do you think there was so little interest to the privatization pilot program that we had in the 1996 law? You mentioned the San Juan Airport, and you said that that's been very successful, but it's not gone beyond that. And why do you think that is? So I guess two questions there, really.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Yes, I would predict that we would see more private sector involvement in infrastructure development. In the LaGuardia case, as was said earlier, it was the most efficient and easy way to get the job done in terms of waiting on the availability of federal funds or other funds. The privatization program, FAA's airport privatization program, has been available for more than a decade. It had a space for 10 airports of different sizes to participate in the program. There have been 10 applicants over that time period, and they have withdrawn those applications to the point that we only have the San Juan example. Part of the problem that we are seeing, again, this is another study that is ongoing for this committee, but part of the problems that we're seeing is that privatization of airports is a really complicated process in the United States, as opposed to in other countries where you don't have as many stakeholders that you need to deal with. When we asked Wall Street about privatization, they said there are competing interests among all the stakeholders. The airlines need something, the airport needs something, the private investor needs something. So, it's just been a difficult slog. FAA revised the privatization program with the hopes that some of this will change. Part of it had to do with what happens to the money in terms of can that money be taken off airport to do other things. All of that's a really complicated issue that's made it very difficult. But again, we're trying to look to see what are those barriers that prevent this from working, and bring that back to this committee so that if necessary, the committee can make whatever adjustments in the statute that they think are appropriate to increase the possibility of having privatization.
All right. Well, thank you. Of course, you already have, maybe part of it is that you already have so many private businesses operating at the airports in the commercial real estate business and fixed base operators and so forth. But thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hey, Mr. Ribble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that we need more than anything is accuracy, and in the projections and in the data, so that we can actually evaluate how we're going to go ahead and either modify or provide current financing. Dr. Dillingham, in your written testimony, I'm quoting from page 5, you say, in addition, according to the most recent FAA forecast, air traffic demand is projected to increase 2.7% per year from 2014 through 2034. Funding for both AIP and PFCs is linked to passenger activity. In this way, Congress aims to direct funds to where it's needed most. Have you done any analysis to determine whether the projections or the forecasts from FAA are accurate?
We have looked at some of FAA's forecasts in various arenas, and as you know, the further out you go with a forecast, the less reliable it becomes. So in the case of FAA's forecast for infrastructure needs, the fact that they do it over a 5-year period with a relook every year makes it a lot more as accurate as you can be under the circumstances. And if there are no unforeseen circumstances, like if we don't have another recession, we don't ever have another SARS epidemic or something like that, we're pretty confident at least a year or two out in terms of FAA's forecast. And with the revisions, it's probably as good as can be expected under the circumstances.
Mr. DeLeon, let me give you some data. In 2001, FAA forecasted U.S. airlines would carry 1 billion passengers by 2012. In 2008, the agency pushed that milestone to 2016. In 2010, it was postponed to 2023. And finally, this year, it was postponed to 2027. What methods do you use in your forecasts, and is there a problem in the methodology? And if the forecasts are that far off, are they still a useful measurement for the Congress to use?
I'm sorry, I had to get on you on the methods of forecast. That's not in my area, but I'll take on you and get back to you on methods used.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you. With that, then, not really knowing how you're going about that, it's not particularly helpful at this time. But I can tell you that we can't make decisions when the data is so far off. Actual passengers in 2012, by the way, were 730 million. So the FAA missed that projection by roughly a third. It creates a real problem for us. And so the data that's being provided is really critical for us to make the right decisions. So, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Okay, any further questions for this panel? Dr. Dillingham, Mr. DeLeon, we thank you very much. First panel is excused. We'll now take just like a 30-second recess for the second panel to get in place.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Everybody ready? Okay, we will reconvene. I'd like to welcome our second panel. Second panel includes Mr. Mark Baker, President and CEO of Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, Mr. Todd Hopley, President and CEO of American Association of Airport Executives, Ms. Sharon Pinkerton, Senior Vice President, Legislative and Regulatory Policy for Airlines for America, Mr. Mark Reese, Chairman of the Board of Directors of Airports Council International North America and Aviation Director for Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. So we welcome you, and Mr. Baker, we're waiting for your statement.
Thank you to the leadership and to the members. I represent AOPA.
Can you pull your mic a little closer?
A little better?
A little
better?
Better. Better?
Better? Okay.
Okay.
There you go. I represent the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, and as an experienced aviator who's had the opportunity to land in over 50 states in this beautiful country, I also represent business background in making decisions about things that go on and around aviation communities. AOPA has over 350,000 members nationwide as a nonprofit and individual membership organization. AOPA's mission is to effectively represent the interest of its members as aircraft owners, pilots, concerning the economy, safety and utility, and the popularity of flight and general aviation. As pilots fly in the United States, we are fortunate to have access to the safest and most efficient air transportation system in the world. The aviation network of over 5,200 public use airports, complemented by 13,000 privately owned landing facilities, is a unique national resource. General aviation is significant. It's an economic engine that contributes $150 billion to the annual gross domestic product and approximately 1.2 million jobs in communities nationwide. Each year, 170 million passengers fly using personal aviation, the equivalent to one of the nation's largest airlines, almost 20% of all airborne passengers. In addition to directly creating jobs, the general aviation airports attract businesses to the communities where they're located and deliver economic benefits far outside the airport boundaries. This may serve as a reliever airports as congested metropolitan areas offer aircraft, including airliners, a safe place to land in the event of emergency. America's airports are a true backbone of aviation, and without a robust airport network, aviation cannot continue. It is important to note that all of the new technologies and capabilities under discussion with NextGen will be underutilized unless pilots have a place to take off and land. America's GA airports foster air transportation and link to many communities to our aviation system in many ways that cannot be achieved by the reliance on a few hundred primary airports. Of the 3,300 airports included in the FAA's National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems, only 499 support scheduled commercial air service. For many other aviation needs, America relies on the other 2,500 public use landing sites, which link America's vast rural expanses to the larger world. GA airports support a wide range of other vital activities, including agriculture, law enforcement, emergency medical transportation, firefighting, pipeline patrol, environmental monitoring, package delivery, wildlife management, and tourism. A broad range of humanitarian and charitable activities also rely on general aviation airports. Small general aviation airports are frequently used to deliver humanitarian aid following natural disasters such as hurricanes or earthquakes. In addition, general aviation operating from small airports are routinely used by charities to connect wounded veterans to their families, bring patients in specialized medical care that would otherwise be gone unwanted. Airports as a critical to the aviation transportation as the on and off ramps to our federal highway system. Congress has wisely recognized that a federal aviation network is only possible by using tax revenues from various parts of the systems for financial support. To illustrate this, how similar this is to other modes, the federal highway system has been built for those states that have contributed since 1956. The interstate and U.S. highway system would only exist in 15 states if that were the case. The other 35 states have been subsidized to create this great international ecosystem. AOPA strongly supports financing the approach of using time-tested systems of passenger transportation, aviation fuel taxes, in combination with the general fund and tax revenues to support the FAA and the aviation system. Funding for the Airport Improvement Program comes from the FAA Airport and Airway Trust Fund, which receives revenues from various series of excise taxes paid by users of the national airspace system, including taxes on aviation fuels. The trust fund was designed to finance investments in airports and the airway system, and to the extent we were available, to cover the operating costs of the air systems as well. However, no general fund revenues are appropriated to support AIP. The Airport Improvement Program provides grants to public agencies, in some cases to private airport owners, for the planning and development of public use airports that are included in the NPIAS and developed by the FAA and submitted to Congress every 2 years. AIP grants for planning and development or noise compatibility projects may go to these federally identified public use airports, including heliports, seaplane bases, and for small primary reliever general aviation airports that cover grants 90% of the eligible costs. Projects for the AIP grant improvement to the airport safety and capacity and security and to meet environmental needs. Without the assistance of federal funding, many small airports could not perform the necessary maintenance projects to ensure runway safety, provide airport lighting, or offer essential services like hangars and tie-downs. The FAA's most recent NPIAS report to Congress indicates that America's airport infrastructure's needs are significant. Over the 5 years from 2013 to 2017, the FAA estimates that airports will require $42.5 billion to meet all eligible AIP infrastructure demands, significantly more than the authorized level in the AIP funding for that period. Despite the growing need, AIP remained at annual levels of $3.5 billion since 2005. It took a slight drop to $3.35 billion. Based on these numbers, it's clear that the need and the annual funding levels are out of balance, while all projects continue to manifest. In conclusion, the general aviation airports play a vital role in the life of this nation. The need for the infrastructure and the safety are important. On behalf of more than 350,000 members of AOPA, we appreciate your leadership in addressing the funding concerns of general aviation so our national transportation system continues to survive on the economic and social humanitarian needs of this nation. Thanks for the opportunity to prepare.
Thank you. Mr. Hopley.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. It's always good to be back before the committee. I have two fundamental points I'd like to make this morning. One, airports need more resources. As frequent travelers, you all know that the airports are teeming with people in the terminals and on the tarmacs. There are facilities that need upgrade and upkeep, many of these facilities designed and constructed at the dawn of the jet age. Do any of us in this room really believe there will be less traffic in the future than there is today in an already constrained environment? I think not. Near-term Band-Aid approaches aren't going to serve the long-term needs of the passengers, our communities, or future generations, and we have neglected infrastructure investments across all modes of transportation for too long. Good enough for now isn't good enough. My members have an obligation to plan for tomorrow. Point two, the passenger facility charge is the best mechanism to deliver this additional resource in today's current budget environment. In the absence of increased federal funding, the best way to close down this airport infrastructure development gap is to increase the passenger facility charge, to give the airports the self-help they need to get the job done. The federal cap on local PFCs was last increased in the year 2000, 14 years ago. And to the members on this side of the dais, I would say, in light of tomorrow's vote, I would observe that in light of tomorrow's vote for the majority leader and majority whip positions, the last time Congress increased the passenger facility charge, it was under the watchful eye of Dick Armey as majority leader and Tom DeLay as majority whip, two conservative Republican members who understood the difference between a tax and a user fee, like all of this committee does intuitively, and Mr. Farenthold mentioned that earlier this morning. In the intervening 14 years, the purchasing power of the PFC has diminished dramatically, from $4.50 to less than $2.50. We're asking this committee to increase the passenger facility charge to $8.50 with periodic indexing for inflation. That will simply restore the purchasing power of the PFC that has been lost over the years. And remember, PFCs are locally imposed, locally justified, locally collected, and locally spent in their communities to meet the pressing needs for future growth. Now, we recognize that an increase in the passenger facility charge is opposed by our colleagues in the airlines, who contend that infrastructure needs are being met and that an extra $4 in fees would significantly decrease demand for air travel. Well, just this morning in the newspaper, I saw that in the last month alone, airline fares increased 6%, the single largest increase in the past 15 years. And if you looked at May 2013 to May 2014, fares have increased by 5%. Now, under the airline logic, where they say that for every dollar or for every 1% increase in fares, there's a greater than 1% decrease in demand for air travel. If that were to be true, clearly we should see a greater than 5% decrease in air traffic as a result of the past year. However, traffic hasn't gone down, demand hasn't gone down, it's gone up. And so it's time to lay to rest this elasticity of demand argument as it relates to the passenger facility charge. And we haven't even mentioned, of course, the issue of bag fees and a $25 or $30 bag fee and its impact on travel. Mr. Chairman, there's clearly a difference of opinion between airports and our airline partners on the status of airport financing and the path forward. I believe that difference can best be explained by the fact that the airlines view the world in a 90-day increment. What is the next financial statement for the shareholder report? Airports have an obligation to look to the future. It takes 2 years and 3 years and 5 years and sometimes 10 years and longer to build major infrastructure projects in this country. An airport has to look out for the long-term interests of its community. The tension between these two positions, between the airports and the airlines, is understandable, but we need you as policymakers to recognize the difference between these two viewpoints and make decisions that are in the long-term best interest of the country. Again, two simple points. One, we need more resources, and two, the passenger facility charge is the best mechanism to deliver those additional resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Pinkerton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to discuss the state of airport financing. From A4A members' perspective, there are three overarching considerations in evaluating airport infrastructure and financing needs. First, airlines need infrastructure. We, more than any other stakeholder, must have sufficient resources to be able to meet the needs of our customers efficiently and effectively. We work in close collaboration with airports, large and small, in order to make sure that necessary capital projects are funded. Second, U.S. airports enjoy consistent and reliable access to ample and an enviable variety of financial resources to pay for airport projects. There is no current or foreseeable crisis in airport funding, in sharp contrast to the issues you're dealing with the Highway Trust Fund today. And third, funding policy should be driven by airport development needs. This demand-focused approach has repeatedly demonstrated projects can be paid for within existing financing means. There is simply no empirical justification to raise airport-related taxes, especially when revenue from other resources is so abundant. The U.S. airline industry, in collaboration with our airport partners, has been supporting and investing in billions of dollars of airport infrastructure. These investments have accelerated in the past few years and are made possible by our improving finances in places such as JFK, Miami, San Diego, Houston, and other areas. A financially healthy airline industry also translates into an especially healthy airport trust fund, which has enjoyed record high revenues from commercial sources. We had a record high $12.7 billion in revenue in 2013 and the highest uncommitted balance in over 13 years. That's $5 billion at the end of 2013, and it's projected to be $6 billion in 2014. Airline-airport collaboration has worked well. U.S. airlines enthusiastically support necessary airport improvement projects. In fact, we're in the midst of massive infrastructure investments across the country, as seen in some of the slides above. This has occurred in close collaboration with airports and has yielded results we can all be proud of. Since 2008, the largest 29 airports alone have started or completed $52 billion worth of capital projects. That's new runways, new international passenger facilities, and new or substantially renovated terminals at both large and small airports. Let's talk about how airports are doing. In 2013, airports collected nearly $24 billion in revenues, a record high level. Part of that is the PFC, $2.8 billion. Part of that is the AIP program, $3.35 billion. That's especially helpful for smaller and GA airports. And then U.S. airports actually have $10 billion on hand in cash and investments. All of these numbers point to a financially strong airport community. Standards & Poor's gives every single airport it evaluates investment-grade credit ratings. Airports and airlines have been able to take advantage of those credit ratings to secure affordable funding for demand-driven and financially justified projects that increase capacity and efficiency. Let's talk about air travel for a moment. The current number of operations today is still lower than what we had in 2007. And the FAA projects that we won't be back to those 2007 level of operations until 2033. So while airport projects will continue to be necessary, the airport system in the United States does not have to build to accommodate rapid or unmanageable growth. Improvement projects can be paid for with existing revenue streams with no need to pursue an increase in the PFC. Bonds remain the primary source of funding for airport capital projects. Historically and even today, over 50% of all projects are funded through bond funding. Airports enjoy access to bond financing at very good rates because of their good investment credit ratings. No U.S. airport, to our knowledge, has been unable to secure bond funding for an airport improvement project. Another reason not to increase the PFC is that U.S. airlines and their customers already pay over $19 billion in taxes and fees, soon to be $20 billion once the TSA fee goes into effect next month. We're already taxed at a rate higher than alcohol and cigarettes, products that are taxed to discourage their use. We've heard every dollar in the PFC means $700 million cost to the passenger. Raising the PFC cap hurts demand, hurts travel and tourism, and negatively impacts small community service. While it's intuitive that raising the cost of something results in less of it, the GAO has also found in 2012 that increasing ticket taxes and thus the price by 1% results in 1% fewer and greater than 1% fewer tickets being sold. In conclusion, today we have a win-win formula that provides for needed infrastructure funding and consists of close collaboration with airports, disciplined, demand-driven development of infrastructure projects, continued reliance on tried and true funding sources, and avoiding punishing the traveling public with additional taxes. We need to stick with that formula. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Reese, you can go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Larson and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to participate in today's hearing. The airport community appreciates the opportunity to explain the state of airports and our challenging capital needs. It is significant that both ACINA and AAAE are represented here today. Our two organizations are unified in our efforts on the upcoming FAA reauthorization, particularly when it comes to airport financing. So I am very pleased to have the opportunity to speak today with our partner, Todd Hopley. I am the Managing Director of the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, and I'm here today in my capacity as Chairman of Airports Council International North America. In addition to my testimony today, please accept my written statement, which offers a fuller overview of the complexities of airport finance, the sources and uses of airport revenues, and the financial challenges airports face today. As has been established, airports are hubs for economic growth within local communities across our nation. U.S. airports, though, lack the ability to raise the revenues necessary to meet our industry's current and future challenges. The federal component of our funding model, which relies most heavily on the underfunded Airport Improvement Program and the undervalued passenger facility charge user fee, is antiquated, complicated, tightly regulated, and not sustainable as we plan for the future. In the United States, the average airport facility is more than 40 years old. It is growing increasingly difficult for us to balance maintenance costs and expansion plans with limited financing options. We have identified more than $71 billion in capital improvements for security, safety, rehabilitation, and facilitation needs that are essential over the next 5 years. Examples include a $95 million runway safety area in Oakland and a $100 million runway rehabilitation project at SeaTac. The limited AIP and PFC funding capacity available is only a fraction of our overall need, especially with so much of future airport revenues, including the PFC user fee already pledged to existing debt service. The challenge for Congress, the airports, and our airline partners will be to find the solution that addresses the needs in a practical and a sustainable way. We believe that restoring the purchasing power of the PFC user fee to $8.50 and indexing it to inflation is the best solution, but it is not the only possible solution to this challenge. Congress could increase AIP funding to meet the urgent infrastructure needs of America's airports, but that would require at least a doubling of the annual AIP appropriation. So while increasing AIP is certainly an option in theory, we understand the congressional focus on decreasing federal spending and its lack of interest in increasing federal aviation taxes makes this option unrealistic. The U.S. aviation industry faces a global challenge. U.S. airports need to stay competitive. Airports in Canada, in partnership with their airline customers, have implemented passenger user charges known as the Airport Improvement Fees, otherwise called AIF, in order to fund needed airport construction and improvements. But unlike the PFC, these fees are not capped by the Canadian federal government. The AIF at some Canadian airports is as high as $30 per passenger. While this is another alternative, we believe the PFC can be updated for a fraction of the Canadian AIF by restoring its purchasing power and periodically adjusting it for inflation. Which brings us back to what I indicated previously as the best alternative. By restoring the spending power of the PFC user fee, this Congress can craft a solution that will allow us to meet the critical infrastructure of Americans' airports and do it cost effectively for airports, airlines, and our passengers. Updating the PFC user fee also increases local control and puts decisions into the hands of local authorities who are best able to determine the level of user fee which is appropriate for their community. By raising the cap of the PFC, this Congress can ensure that our airports continue to be engines of economic growth in their respective communities and across the country. This subcommittee will have a significant impact next year on the future of airport financing. The airport community remains committed to working alongside you and other aviation shareholders to develop a sustainable means to satisfy the demands of 21st century traveling public. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you all for your testimony. By the way, my name is Reed Ribble. I represent Wisconsin's 8th Congressional District, so it has Appleton and Green Bay, Wisconsin. Thanks for your testimony. Mr. Baker, I'm going to start with you if I could. Could you give us an idea of the cost of general aviation to the pilots? What types of fees are they paying, and what's the work that goes into being a general aviation pilot and the cost related to that?
Well, the cost of, first of all, acquiring a pilot's license today would be where most people start. We graduated about 22,000 pilots last year. Some will head off into commercial aviation, some are just recreation or business aviation. We think about the basic license of a private today running anywhere from $7,000 to $10,000 just to get your first primary license. If you're going all the way up into commercial aviation, you could expect us to pay between $80,000 and $100,000 to gain that education and experience today. So very expensive. And then the fees associated with that today are fuel tax, which we think is a very efficient way. By the way, the more you fly, the more you pay. Into general aviation is the best way to do it. But there are other fees and taxes that are starting to creep into the system. In many cases, there's landing fees, service fees, and all the other things that come to using it as a facility for general aviation airports. In many cases, we have a choice to avoid those and go to smaller airports which don't charge those fees. And I think you're starting to see a population that moves in that direction. There are other things in terms of getting your weather and getting your mapping and all those things that are required for most pilots to buy, either a service online or by maps and charts today that can be $1,000 or more a year.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Hopley,
yes, sir.
Look at the PFC cap. You're advocating raising the cap to $850 and then indexing it. How is that cap actually assessed? Let's say someone like me flies from Green Bay, Wisconsin to Chicago, then from Chicago to Houston. You've got a takeoff in Green Bay, a landing in Chicago, takeoff in Chicago, landing in Houston, and then return, takeoff in Houston, landing in Chicago, takeoff in Chicago, landing in Green Bay. How many times is that fee assessed?
Not more than twice in each direction.
Okay, so not more than twice in each
That's
direction,
correct.
or twice
So
in each direction?
Yeah, it would depend on whether or not the airport had a PFC imposed at that airport.
Okay. In this case, O'Hare and Houston International and Austin Straubel and Green Bay.
In the case that you cited now, that Houston, in fact, has a PFC in place, which it did not for many years, there would be a PFC imposed in Green Bay for taking off there, and then again in Chicago on the way, and then on the way back it would be in Houston, and then again in Chicago.
In Chicago. All right, thank you. Do you have an opinion, or would you agree that there is an elasticity of price in the marketplace? Do you make decisions on purchasing based on price?
Yes. In a conceptual way, I agree there is an elasticity argument to be made.
All right.
Conceptually.
Okay.
and then, if I may,
Yeah, please
and
do.
I'm glad that the chairman is back because he raised this issue earlier this morning.
We're all glad the chairman's back.
He asked about elasticity of demand, and the airlines contend that for every 1% increase in fare prices, there is a greater than 1% decrease in demand for air travel. However, in the past year, from May of 2013 to May of 2014, airline fares increased 5%. Now, you would expect, based on this elasticity of demand argument that they put forward, that there would be at least a 5% reduction in demand for air travel. However, what we've seen over the past year is an increase, not a decrease, but an increase in air travel. So that elasticity of demand argument doesn't work very well, at least in that example.
Well, Ms. Pinkerton, how do you answer that?
Happy to answer that. Thank you. First of all, it's not the airlines that argue about price elasticity. It's every economist that's studied the topic that acknowledges there is definitely, when you increase the cost of something, people buy less of it. So it's interesting what Todd's discussing about airfares going up. First of all, it's important to remember, since 2000, in real terms, airfares have actually dropped 10%. That's when adjusted for inflation. So in the big picture, airfares are affordable and they're a real value. Yes, airfares have gone up in 2013, 5%. That's a good thing. It's a good thing because when carriers are able to recognize revenue from a route, what do they do with that revenue? They plow it back into the route. So they may increase service, which I know all of you are interested in, increasing service to your community. They may upgauge the plane, et cetera. In terms of the elasticity of demand, our fares have gone up a bit. The demand has probably not gone up as much as it would have. In other words, there is still an impact. Yes, there may be increasing demand, but it's not going up as much as it would have had there not been increased costs. The important thing to remember here, though, is the difference between an increase in an airfare and an increase in a PFC is that a PFC is a mandatory and system-wide increase in the cost. The airfare, on the other hand, is a flexible tool. When the economy softens or fuel goes over the roof, airfares can be pulled back down, and they often are pulled back down. But when you increase the PFC, I can guarantee you it'll never go back down.
I'm just one last question for you, Ms. Pinkerton, then I'm going to turn it over to the ranking member. But the majority of PFC applications by airports are submitted to the FAA without airline objections. Can you explain why airlines are generally supportive of specific projects but are opposed to raising the cap?
Sure, I can. I think what I've tried to lay out in my testimony is that what we see is airports have a toolbox of tools for funding airport infrastructure. And there is an abundance of resources right now. By the end of 2014, there's going to be $6 billion of uncommitted trust fund balance. So PFCs were created as one tool in the toolbox, and as I said, and I showed the $52 billion worth of projects that we've supported over the past 5 years, we do support infrastructure projects. We need those projects, and we work collaboratively with airport partners on PFC projects. So while we do work collaboratively with them, what we're saying is that going forward, because of the resource situation that we are in right now with a $6 billion uncommitted balance, with all-time record revenues from commercial carriers and their passengers, all-time record revenues for non-airline revenues, there's really no point in increasing the PFC. You'd simply be punishing the passenger who's already paying $19 billion, soon to be $20 billion, while there is an abundance of resources available to fund needed projects.
All right, thank you. With that, I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Larson.
Mr. Reese, thanks for making the trip. I understand you have to leave about 1 o'clock.
1:30 is probably good.
Oh, okay, great. Maybe it's me I has to leave at 1. I forget. Can you help us understand a little bit about this question of bonding capacity, how it's used? Clearly, it has to be financed. It's not just you got bonds and you're given the free money and you never have to pay anything back. You have to have a source of revenue to pay that back. Presumably, PFCs are included in that package of sources of revenue. But if you're limited at 450, or if an airport like McCarran, as you rolled out in your written testimony, said they've pretty much maxed out their ability to use a PFC to finance anything more, they have to go to other sources. What other sources are there, and kind of where do those burdens fall?
Thank you. Just like most everything else, life is complicated, and there's not a single answer. And of course, what is true and possible at SeaTac Airport, which is one of the faster-growing airports in the country, where we have airlines very interested in coming to Seattle and increasing their activity at Seattle, is not going to be true at a small airport which has lost air service in another part of the country and does not have access to necessarily all the same tools. So I'll talk about it from SeaTac's point of view and then elaborate a little bit about other airports. So you're absolutely right, Mr. Larson, that the acquisition of funds from a bond issue is just a first step in a way to fund a construction program. It doesn't have anything to do with the ability to pay it back. So for us to borrow the money, we have to convince the bankers and the rating agencies that we have a long-term stable source of cash to pay back that money. It's going to come from essentially one of 3 places. We can put the debt service for the bond repayment into the airline rate base, which of course will drive up airline costs at the airport. We can utilize non-airline net income to the degree we're able to generate that. And we can use PFCs to pay back debt service. And we, of course, could also use PFCs to pay for a project on a pay-as-you-go basis, but the most efficient way to use PFCs is to use it to pay debt service.
So non-airline net income would be parking fees, concession fees.
Exactly.
The $10 I pay for a coffee there versus the $5 I pay outside of the airport.
I think we've had this conversation before. At SeaTac Airport, unlike some airports, we do have a street pricing point of view. So you're going to pay the same price at SeaTac inside the airport. But the net income after you pay the operating expenses for any of those things like concessions and parking, et cetera, is one of the sources. And it presumably is included in the number that Ms. Pinkerton noted, $24 billion. Well, at SeaTac, for example, we have 36 competitors for our parking operation. We are making more than 10% less in parking now than we did prior to the last recession as a result of the competition. So all of these numbers don't just go up, and of course the airlines don't want us to put increased debt service in their rate base because that causes their cost to go up.
And just to clarify, the rate base, so you have PFCs, which you hear a lot about, but you have flexibility to negotiate with airlines on other fees, landing fees, and what else?
Exactly. Landing fees, terminal rents of various sorts.
Okay.
And each airport has a different relationship legally, contractually, from an agreement point of view with airlines. So the ability of an airline or airlines to approve or to veto a investment is different depending on the airport. So coming back to the PFCs, we have a $2.5 billion capital program scheduled for the next 10 years. We anticipate having to borrow well above $1.5 billion of that $2.5 billion. At the moment, our PFCs are almost completely maxed out, meaning fully allocated to existing debt service. So when Ms. Pinkerton says that we have lots, abundant, I think is the word, of funding sources, I would, even at an airport that is growing, that is in a very vibrant city where a lot of airlines want to fly, I would dispute that we have abundant sources. We are seeing a slow growth in non-airline revenue. We are maxed out in terms of dedication of our PFCs to existing debt service, and we will see the airline fees have to go up dramatically to pay for some of this capital program.
Okay. We may have to go into detail at a different time, and not this hearing, but so the recent announcement about the international arrival facility, SeaTac and presumably Delta are partnering on financing that?
Well, SeaTac will be financing it completely. Delta is very supportive of it because it is important to their growth as an international gateway in Seattle. But that's one of the major projects of this $2.5 billion program. What is also quite interesting is neither Delta nor Alaska Airlines are particularly excited about growing the PFC. That said, we have about a $450 million terminal or concourse redevelopment project ahead of us that will be fully occupied by Alaska Airlines. We have an international arrivals facility, about $350 million project, that Delta will certainly be just one of many airlines using it, but it will have more flights there than any of the other airlines. They are arguing over how we allocate the limited PFCs that we have available to the payment of those two projects. So they don't like the PFC in general, but they like it when it will allow them to decrease their terminal rents. Because that is, in fact, the real benefit to the airlines is we do not include the cost of debt service in a rate base if it's paid for by the PFC. If it's not paid for the PFC, we then charge the airlines for that debt service.
Right, right. Good. Just another set of questions for Ms. Pinkerton, and I'm not asking this to be snarky. It might sound like it because it has to do because I'm never snarky. Because it has to do with bag fees, yes. Baggage fees, which is a huge source of revenue, a relative source of revenue
6%
for airlines generally, and this issue of elasticity. Yeah. So, is there a price elasticity to bag fees? Have the airlines found that?
So I certainly understand the question on bag fees, but let me just start with this.
Start with the answer to my question.
Okay. Bag fees, when we fly, we have an option about checking bags.
Right.
You don't have an option about whether or not to use an airport.
Right.
So
have you
the
seen
unbundling? What we've done is unbundle.
I'm getting to the question though. Getting to a question about dedicating that revenue and where that revenue goes. But have you found that have you found fewer bags as a result of bag fees going on airplanes or being checked? I have seen the overhead bins. Yeah, but if there's a price elasticity,
there was a change initially, but now it's actually evened out,
leveled out. So the next question I have is, with that revenue or any other revenue from airlines, does all that go into airline operations, airplane purchases, or is there, given this question about P3 financing and so on, do airlines look at that as a source of revenue to help then on the development side of infrastructure of airports?
No, it's a great question, and I mean what?
See, I told you I was getting to a nice place.
Yes,
I did.
yeah. And so what you've seen since 2010, since airlines have started to make small margins, you've seen us plowing that money back into planes. So we've got 255 planes that are going to be delivered in 2014. That's good for customers. Half of those are Boeing planes. Most importantly, we're starting to hire people. During the last decade, when we lost $60 billion, we laid off a third of our employees. That's traumatic for all of us. But since 2010, we've started to build back up our employee base. In the last 9 quarters, we've consecutively, every quarter, added seats. So that's exactly the kind of thing we're doing. We're investing back in CapEx, is what we call it, $12 billion a year in capital expenditures. So that's for planes, for Wi-Fi, in-flight entertainment. Again, our employees, training, baggage systems. We've invested, Delta, Alaska, we've invested in baggage systems. And as a result, we have a much lower mishandled bag rate today than we ever did.
Yeah, okay. Well, you see what I'm getting at in terms of trying to figure out what are the sources, what are the ideas out there regarding
Absolutely.
investment in infrastructure.
And I think that, you know, the $52 billion that we've shown that we've invested over the last 5 years demonstrates that when we are able to make small margins, we reinvest it back in airport infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
Mr. Meehan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Reese, I am particularly interested in your experiences in Washington because obviously in busy airports we're looking for ways to support the growth, but also to make sure that the resources that are coming in are going where they're most needed. And explain to me the percentages, so to speak, when you talk about these other fees that are out there: parking, terminal rents, landing fees, concessions, rental cars. I mean, there's a whole series of other kinds of things. And I always get concerned, maybe it's the cynic in me, when I see these sort of big municipal airports. There's a lot of fat in there. There's a lot of jobs and other kinds of things, not performing jobs, but people that are on. How do you take parking fees and assure that it's, you know, it's an efficient price? They pay a lot to park. You know, people are paying $25, $30 a day to park. The concessions. My colleague from Massachusetts was concerned about, you know, a lot of money going in to build stores that you don't see much traffic in. And how are they supported? So where are the decisions made to assure that the dollars that are being raised are actually being put back in where it needs to be, which is a significant cost to airline, you know, infrastructure improvement?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a very appropriate one. Let me first reinforce perhaps a little bit more clearly than what was stated in the previous panel. We as airports are not able to use any AIP or PFC money to build any revenue, non-airline revenue producing facilities. So no AIP or PFC money is ever used for facilities at a terminal in which a retail or a dining facility will go. It's just prohibited. In fact...
Well, how's that funded then?
It is funded through non-airline revenue. So we operate...
What is non-airline revenue? I mean, and how do we know that the monies aren't getting diverted into that kind of a thing when we need that money to go into the ability to put down more concrete?
You're absolutely right. And Congress has been very clear on this subject. The FAA is quite clear on the subject. We go through an annual audit, not just our financial audit, but a complex, comprehensive audit that is done for any airport that collects a PFC or an AIP. Those are the kinds of questions that are asked to make sure that no money is diverted from an aeronautical use to a non-aeronautical use. So our garage, fully funded from different non-aeronautical purposes. The debt service on that has to be paid back from non-aeronautical services. When we build a new facility, I mentioned the reconstruction of this concourse, or of our North Satellite concourse, we will have to demonstrate to the bond community and to the FAA what percentage of that reinvestment will be for aeronautical purposes, and we have to be very careful to not use any money that is associated with the airlines paying us back by contract, or federal money, or PFC.
So the bottom line is,
or the other side.
I can lok at an audit to determine whether there's efficiency with regard to those things.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And I just, Ms. Pinkerton, I also serve on Homeland Security, and I know you're going to be getting a pretty hefty fee coming up, almost $1 billion in new increases because of the pay for TSA. I think it's going from $250 to $650. If you include that, you know, the security tax and other federal taxes and fees and that are currently paid, how much of the fees go to Uncle Sam as opposed to the airport?
Well, there's $3 billion in PFCs that go to the airport, and then of course the $3.35 billion that goes, an AIP that goes to the airports as well. So that's $6 billion out of the $20 billion. With the TSA fee increase, passengers and carriers will be paying $20 billion in taxes, special aviation taxes every year. And so $14 billion goes to Uncle Sam and $6 billion goes to...
Is this going to have an increase? We're talking about, do you think it's going to have an impact on flight utilization, demand because of these increases?
Yeah, I mean, as we've discussed before, GAO, every other economist that's studied the issue acknowledges that when you increase the price of something, you get less of it. There's no doubt about that.
All right. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I found the discussion of elasticity enlightening, having been an economics major in college till one day I woke up and realized it wasn't a science. And, you know, I would say that the discussion of elasticity sort of leads us there. And I just have to follow up a little bit. I'm sorry. But, Ms. Pinkerton, you mentioned average fares are down. Does that calculation include, I think the time you quoted was when 88% of the passenger costs were fares. Now it's 71% are fares. Does that average include the baggage fees?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Because if I hadn't included them, fares would be down 15%.
Okay.
Including them, they're down 10%.
Yes, but of course, remember, it's also an average fare, and it's not evenly distributed. Some regions and or airports have seen increases. Others, where there's more competition, have seen decreases. So
it's true.
Now, I'm trying to, you know, again, as the author of the PFC, I'm not for indiscriminate raising of fees. And in part, as you know, since I'm sponsoring the transparency bill with the chairman, I went on that because I was upset that one of the last budget deals just threw an additional nominal cost that's supposedly going to security onto passengers. So I believe in having that full disclosure on both sides of the ledger, both with the airlines and with the government fees. But I think here that on PFCs, I mean, someone raised the point that for the most part, airlines have not objected to the specific imposition of PFCs for many projects. That's correct?
Yes.
For the most part, right. So essentially, there are projects that are good that utilize PFCs. We had Dr. Dillingham say they haven't been abused, which was why they went away from the first iteration and why we rebirthed them with a whole different set of restrictions, and they've been, I think, pretty good. But hearing from Mr. Reese, wouldn't you agree that at some point an airport which has used PFCs with support of the airlines to do meritorious things that improve the customer experience in the airline's operations may have bumped against the ceiling, may not have other options, and maybe you need some flexibility to go a little higher in those cases with a PFC?
Well, I don't think you were here for my testimony, but
Well,
we indeed support airport projects. SeaTac, we were very supportive of the new runway, the international facility. What we're arguing, Congressman DeFazio, is yes, we've supported these PFC projects, but there is abundant funding available, whether it is AIP
I read your
or
testimony
bonding
and I
in
caught some of that,
particular.
if I could just interrupt. I mean, but he also pointed out the limitations of that, and we don't
But
live
he's
we
moving
don't live in
forward
the
with
world
his
of the
projects.
abundance theory, you know, which I know is a theory out there. We all think positive thoughts and
He-
it'll happen, but
he is moving forward with his projects. They are
Right.
moving forward. Nothing's
But
been
there may be cases.
stopped.
What I'm getting at is the objection of the airlines to an increase in the PFC because you think it'll be indiscriminately applied once it becomes available across the industry. And therefore, virtually everybody's going to raise their fee, and they're going to do discretionary things that they could have done with other money, or they wouldn't have done if, you know, given their limits that don't benefit passengers and operations. Is that the concern?
No, the objection is that passengers are already paying too much, and there is
Yeah, but too much is
$6
the
billion
whole experience.
$6 billion
is the whole
in
ball
the
of
trust
wax.
fund available.
You know,
so you have other ways of doing it. The PFC is not the tool.
But
that you use.
if there are cases where there isn't another way to do it,
But there
and
aren't
we
any.
need to
But there aren't
discuss
any.
the AIP. Now, Ms. Pinkerton, please, you know the procedures here, and I'm being very nice to you, so you've got to not be quite so argumentative. We're talking about total costs, total burden, on the consumers. And if we add $1 for baggage, that's $1 more. If we add $1 for PFC, it's $1 more. I could argue that if I added $1 for PFC, that got me out of some incredibly congested, problematic security area in some airport, my passenger experience is much more enhanced than paying an extra $1. Well, I don't pay it because of my, my frequent flyer status, and I never check bags except twice a year, maybe. So, but people who have to pay the extra $1. So it's, it's coming out of their pocket one way or another. The same elasticity is going to apply because it's the total cost. So I guess, what I'm trying to get at here, is there a way, not just taking the existing PFC with restrictions and saying, okay, anybody can go up this much, but saying, well, maybe we could add an increment, or maybe we could index it for inflation and they could add at least that increment. Is there something you could agree that might be beneficial to operations and passengers that might otherwise not happen without that flexibility? Or you just think there's always going to be another way to pay for these things?
There has always been another way.
Okay, all right.
And all
okay, we
projects
got
are
that.
being
Okay,
funded.
Mr. Hopley, would you respond to that?
Yes, Mr. DeFazio, we disagree.
Yes.
On that.
Okay. Well, good. But could you expand briefly?
You used the example of a $1 here or a $1 there. Would that it would only be that much in the case of a bag fee at the total experience, $25.
No, I just meant increases. I was talking about increases.
Right. So, no, I think we have, as Mr. Reese pointed out, there are limitations in our ability to do what we need to do. There is an infrastructure investment gap that exists today that is incontrovertible, and that it, I think, is highly unlikely, as much as this committee would like to authorize funding levels at dramatically increased levels from where we are today. That seems very unlikely given the budget environment we are in. So I believe, and I think airports across the country believe, that the best way of providing the necessary infrastructure investment is the self-help of allowing airports to impose a higher PFC locally.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I know I'm over time, but I just want to say, and again, I used it briefly at the beginning, there's another issue, which is an equity issue, and it first came up where I live in Springfield, Oregon. Eugene, Oregon was going to build a new airport, and they were going to bond it, and they were going to, all the taxpayers in Eugene were going to pay for it. And I said, well, I use the airport more than anybody in Eugene. That's not fair. That was part of the genesis. And the other was an interstate issue, which is Portland Airport serves Vancouver, Washington. And those people don't pay any taxes in the state of Oregon. And I felt it was fair to be able to put some of the costs on them. And I think everyone would agree the program has worked. I think we disagree over whether there are other options and whether it's adequate for the future and whether there are ways we could massage it. And I'd love to continue that discussion in a more productive way than we can here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman Schuster.
Thank you, Mr. Ribble, and thank the panel for being here. Sorry I've been in and out, so I didn't hear much of what you said, but I certainly, if I ask a question or repeat myself, hope you'll bear with me. I think this issue is obviously a tough issue. We've got airports got to keep doing things to make sure they're staying fresh and the customers are coming and can take care of them. And you've got an airline industry that's just now starting to make profits for the first time in years. And when you look at the last 30 years, I think it's fair to say you haven't made any money, and that's difficult. And so when I started with my opening statement, before I ask a question, doing something different at the FAA, trying to figure out how we can get an airline industry, and I think they've finally, some would argue they've downsized too far. I think they've right-sized, and I think we're going to see an industry that's profitable. And when you look around transportation industry, what the railroads have done over years, and it's different, but it's still, there's a profitable industry that is paying for its own infrastructure, not relying on the federal government. I don't know that that's ever going to be possible, but it's reducing the relying on the government for paying for its infrastructure, I think should be the goal. When we, again, talk about PFCs, Mr. Reese, if you were to increase your PFCs, what kind of projects are you going to be able to move forward with? I know you're doing some projects now. What will you be able to move forward with? What types of things?
Well, we have a $2.5 billion program. We anticipate having to borrow $1.5 to $2 billion of that $2.5 billion. So we have got reconstruction of two 45-year-old concourses that have effectively not been touched in most of that period of time. We have a new international arrivals facility, reconstruction of one of our 3 runways that'll be a $100 million project. You don't think about little things like vertical circulation. So we have
what is that?
Vertical circulation. It's a fancy word for elevators and escalators. Okay. We have about 60 escalators. Many of them are 50 years old. And so as an airport expands, the airport was last completely redone in 1973, at which point there were 5 million passengers and an anticipation of 25 million passengers. We're now at 35. So we have got everything from infrastructure no one will ever see, electrical systems, all the way through a brand new international arrivals facility and sort of everything in between.
Well, let me ask you the converse of that. What aren't you doing? Because you don't have the...
Well, this is a plan, and the question is, how do we fund it? Now, we are very lucky, unlike many of our colleagues, both large airports and especially small airports, in that our airline agreement, the contract we have with our airline partners, does not provide the airlines a veto over our decisions. Many of my colleagues do not have that luxury. So when you talk about the PFC as a funding mechanism, in many ways, what we're really talking about is control. Will the local governing body, because they have adequate PFC resources, be able to make the decisions for what's good for their community and their airport, or will the airlines be able to veto the desires of the local community? The PFC, because it's locally imposed, locally decided upon, provides local governing bodies, whether it be a city council or an authority board like ours, the ability to make those decisions. If it is, the PFC is inadequate and the only option is to have the airlines pay for those costs, pay that debt service, then in many instances the airlines have the ability to say, no, community, we don't agree with your priorities, you can't make that investment. That happened to us recently on a cargo project. The airlines voted it down. Now, luckily, all we had to do was wait 6 months and do it, but in many communities, they would not be able to do it because the airlines vetoed it. So in many ways, a PFC increase so that it stays up with inflation is a way to let local communities make decisions about what's good for their airport as opposed to letting the airlines dictate it.
And Mr. Hopley, on that question, the broader industry, the Airport Association, what projects aren't getting done? It sounds CTEC's doing a lot. Can you talk about other places in the country that we're not seeing it happen?
Sure. Let me just circle back very quickly to a point that you just made a couple of moments ago about the reliance on federal funding. What we're asking for is exactly that. We're asking to be less reliant on the federal government. We're asking for the self-help to let us get out of the federal government controlling these decisions. That's the beauty of the passenger facility charge. In a constrained federal budget environment that we're in today, this allows for the needed infrastructure investment without the reliance on federal funding. On the issue that you raise, Mr. Chairman, an example would be in the city of Chicago, where up to a point, the city of Chicago and the airlines have negotiated what they mutually agree is necessary to be built for that airport. However, there remains other parts of that modernization program that the airlines don't agree need to be funded. And the city of Chicago has baked into their financing plans an increase in the passenger facility charge in order to complete that project. Again, a difference of opinion about what the need is, what the scope is, how far into the future you should look. A legitimate disagreement of opinion, but an example where the community is looking out further out into the future than the carriers that are currently operating at that facility are looking.
Right. What about places like Pittsburgh and Kansas City, and I guess Cleveland now has been, they call it dehubbed? You know,
I don't have examples for you from those, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Ms. Pinkerton, it appears the forecasting we're going to have lots more people, and We're also going to have a lot more people in this country in the next 20 years. We're going to have over close to 400 million people. If we continue to see that kind of, additional funds building infrastructure, where do they come from? Where are your thoughts on that?
So, first of all, I think what you've heard from me is violent agreement that airlines and airports need to work together on needed infrastructure. And we've demonstrated that we're willing to do that, and we'll continue to do that. The disagreement comes in how we do that. And the case I'm making is that there are record revenues in PFCs, there are AIP funding, there's record airline rents, and there's record private funding. There's a $6 billion uncommitted balance in the Aviation Trust Fund, something very different than what you're facing in the Highway Trust Fund.
Right.
And so we're not arguing that things don't need to be built. They do, and we agree with that. We just don't think you need to tax passengers to build those projects. We think bond funding is available. All of the projects that Mr. Reese talked about, they're going forward. They are moving forward.
And when they're bond funded or financed,
Exactly.
the airlines are
Absolutely.
paying that in their rent factor.
Exactly. So we've made a policy decision. We'd rather pay for it in our rents and fees than seeing passengers taxed,
Right.
especially when there's a $6 billion uncommitted balance in the trust fund.
Right. And finally, Mr. Baker, I understand this is your first time before the committee, so it was welcome. I know you're ably staffed back there. Your team, you got a good team there that know a thing or two about this committee. Mr. Ribble asked a question, and you may have answered it and I may have missed it, the various different cost for the general aviation community. And the cost I'm looking for is, what do you pay to land or take off, whatever they pay? I know it's different at other places, but can you give me a sense of what a general aviation operator's paying, taking off and landing fees?
It's all over the map. I was this weekend over in Ocean City, Maryland, and it was $40 to land my little airplane there, and another $40 to park it overnight for that facility for one-time use. It's a great facility. It was well used. It's a great way to see the Jersey Shore. I've traveled through your great state and used reliever airports around Pittsburgh a number of times, and certainly Appleton and other places are great airports you can use. It is up to the discretion of each individual airport. In some cases, you really don't know until you get there how much they're going to charge you for their service fee. Some cases are waived if you buy fuel. Other cases, there's an overnight fee for parking your aircraft outside. For the most part, they're reasonable, and you have the choice once you gain that knowledge if you want to use that airport or a different airport that may have a lower cost. So that's, we see the fuel tax as the primary way we pay our part of our deal.
What do they range? And they said they're all over the map. What are they, from $20 to, like a place like Teterboro, would you pay a high fee to have to land there?
Oh, yeah. As an example, if you go into Boston, you'll pay $300-400 to land at Logan. If you go into Appleton, it's free at the moment. Thank you. So it is all over the map.
Okay. All right. Well, again, I appreciate you being here today. I appreciate all of you being here today. And hopefully you're all going to go to Tarkio, which is the center of the world for GA in July. I think you're going to be there, Mr. Baker. I encourage everybody else to check it out. I have to say that commercial for Mr. Graves. It's his air show, or not his air show, but he's very involved in it. Again, I appreciate all of you being here. And again, I think we've had all of you, Mr. Reese, and I know Mr. Hopley and Sharon, somebody from your organization's been to one of our listening sessions, and I don't know if we've had the GA. No, we're going to do the GA community listening session out in Tarkio. So, but it's important that we figure a way forward. I know these issues, funding is always a struggle, but making sure that we have an airline industry, an aviation industry that's strong and viable, because I think from all corners of the globe we're under attack. Whether it's the Mideastern air carriers or the manufacturers who are producing parts and aircraft for the GA community, if we don't have an FAA that functions more efficiently than it does today, we're going to slowly start to see our number one status in the world deteriorate, and that's something that I think all Americans should pay attention to and not let it happen. So again, I appreciate you all being here today. I appreciate the exchange of information, ideas, and opinions, and we look forward to continuing working with you. Thank you.
And the chair thanks the chairman of the full committee for his insightful questions and really illuminating that. Chair would recognize itself for a couple of very brief questions. Ms. Reese, AIP funding has been talked about today. Are there different restrictions on that funding based on the size of the airport?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure there are differentiations between size, although I will not claim to be an expert on that field. For small airports, very small airports, GA airports get a certain dollar amount every year as an entitlement, unlike larger airports, which get it as a percentage of the total amount available. There is a fixed amount, and they can use it with a great deal of discretion at the very small end. But once you get into the commercial service airports, certainly small, medium, and large, I think we all have to live by the same rules. The key thing is really competition for the discretionary dollars. That the FAA does a very good job of looking at the amount of money that's available on a discretionary basis and saying what is going to make the greatest contribution to the objectives that Congress might have put into statute or that the FAA has put into their own guidance. And the projects, no matter which airport it is, that are going to make the greatest contribution to the benefit of the overall system are going to end up competing better than another project that might be technically qualified but may not make as great a contribution to the system.
But wouldn't that inherently disadvantage smaller, more rural airports? Because if you do that, then based on traffic flow and everything else, all the federal dollars will go to the major cities, and it will continue to do that. Is there not a better way to give greater flexibility to the small rural? Well, and I just happen to represent a small rural airport. Is why I would ask.
Right. Well, in round numbers, and again, I'm not a real expert on this really complex system, but of the $3.3 billion program, about $3.1 billion is actually made available to airports. There's some other stuff that's done off the top. And of the $3.1 billion or so, somewhere in the $300 to $700 million is discretionary money. The rest of it is allocated on an apportionment or an entitlement basis. And so a airport is going to get a certain amount of money based on their size. But you're absolutely right. In terms of the discretionary amount, whatever that might be in any given year, a large airport has a much better chance of making the case that its project is making a contribution to the overall system for that discretionary amount than a smaller airport would. That's one of the reasons why we as large airports who can take the greatest advantage of a PFC increase because we have a lot of enplanements and thus more PFCs, recognize that we have to see in the future that the AIP really needs to be preserved for the smaller airports. And that if a PFC is adequately sized, I think you will find that most, if not all, very large airports are going to recognize that a decrease in AIP for large airports is part of the benefit to the overall system.
I'll go ahead and yield to Mr. Larson so he can do a follow-up question.
It's actually a different issue.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So just a different issue, actually. Trying to understand Ms. Pinkerton, your comments about the unobligated balance in the trust fund of $6 billion or so. Much like other unobligated balances in accounts in the federal government, administrations, current and past, use those to mask the size of the actual deficit, not allowing the full spend down of those dollars. For instance, we had a problem with Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund recently, and we fixed that through the WRDA bill, Water Resources Development Act, that says we're going to start spending down the unobligated balances because there were limits on doing that, limited by what we've actually authorized. So I'm curious about this unobligated balance in the trust fund. Is it not limited by what we've actually authorized to be spent, and therefore it's not really yet accessible to be spent down?
No, I believe the reason we've seen an increase in the balance is in the last reauthorization bill, you did change the way the money is spent out. So I suppose in a way the answer is yes. The money is spent based partially on a forecast of what's going to come in versus what does come in. So I think what's happened is we've had, again, records amounts of money coming in that weren't anticipated, and thus the balance is built up.
And therefore not able to be spent out
Right.
as a result.
Yeah.
So that's so we would have to
Change that.
we'd have to change that in order for those
The
dollars
formula.
to be accessible.
Correct.
It's not a matter of just saying it's sitting there. Why don't the airports use it?
Right.
The answer is they can't.
Correct. It's a
Mark.
policy decision.
Yeah,
It's made
right.
in the bill.
Yeah. Mark, very quickly.
I just wanted to make sure that we recognize that this is the Airports and Airways Trust Fund.
Yeah, right,
And so it is not all designed for AIP. The Congress is facing a very large bill for NextGen, and the F&E, the facilities and equipment budget, comes out of that as well. So I would not imagine that it's all going to be available to airports.
Right. I sure got it. Thank you.
Thank you. One follow-up question, Mr. Reese. When you talked in April at a hearing, you talked about small and rural communities and the cost per employment, and talked about the relationship, I guess, between the cost per employment and air service and different financing options. How would those financing options actually lower an airport's cost of employment? And that's as a follow-up to your April testimony.
Right. Well, for small airports, they have many fewer options to finance than large airports do.
So it really wouldn't lower the cost?
I don't know that a increased PFC for an airport that does not have very many employments is not going to generate a lot of money. They don't have
financing option is really for the bigger airports.
I think that's correct. A small airport has got very few options.
All right. If there are no further questions, I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony, the members, obviously, for their participation, and this subcommittee stands adjourned.